Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars, the podcast series here on the channel where we talk about a ton of different topics from Gran Turismo, Forza, a variety of other things, could be YouTube or gaming in general. And as you heard me say, this is now of course officially a podcast series, so jump on over to the SoundCloud link down in the description, and later on today I will be releasing the audio-only version for those who do like to listen to these in their podcast form. But as I said last week, for the moment, the video side of things definitely benefits this channel a lot more currently than the podcast does. That's just for those people who like that. So, as far as this topic goes, you'll have seen from the title and the thumbnail, it's one of our more conceptual discussions between you and I in the comments, and I think this will be a very good one in terms of bringing personal experience and personal preference into the discussion, more so than something like, oh, what's the best car in the game, or talking, factual stuff like what Polyphony's doing, or predictions for the future of the game, and stuff like that, where it's more set kind of stuff, whereas this is, by definition, all about your personal experience. And, of course, that particular topic is, why do we love racing games? Seems like a question which doesn't really need to be asked, and yet, if you try to answer it, it's not necessarily as easy as you might think. It does require some thought, because there are certain things in life that you tend to just like them or dislike them, and you never really think why you like or dislike it, you just do. Like a certain food, for instance, you might just like it. And of course it's based on the taste, it's based on the texture, it's based on maybe the look of the food, the smell of it, but you never think about that, you just like it, or you don't. So when you actually analyse why do we love racing games, it could be an interesting discussion. Maybe realise things about yourself and about your personality that you didn't know before. Maybe past experiences that affected you in ways that you didn't know. Now for me, my experience with racing games is very different to a lot of people who seem to love stuff like the purely online aspect of GT Sport, or Assetto Corsa, or Project Cars, or that kind of thing, where the game is very clearly focused and biased toward that pure human versus human racing aspect. Whereas for me, that has never been even close to the top of the list on my agenda of what makes a game one of my favourites. In fact, if you were to look at a list of my top 10 favourite racing games, the vast majority of those on the list wouldn't even have much of an online mode anyway. For instance, stuff like Gran Turismo 4, Test Drive Unlimited, games that you can play, and they do have an online aspect, but it's not about that. You can have just as much fun on your own as you can with other people. Now, there are only two games, actually, that I've ever played, or two racing games, that have really stood out to me in offering a level of fun in racing, specifically against other real people, that other games haven't achieved for me. And of course what I mean by that is a game that I actually like the online racing on, because usually, as I said, it doesn't really mean that much to me. But the funny thing is, those two games that I've enjoyed the online racing in the most are completely different to each other, in pretty much every way, despite being, the only similarity between them is that they're racing games. One is GT Sport, interestingly, and I'm not talking about the game as a whole, I'm purely talking about the online racing experience. I do like it. Of course, many of you have been watching my Sport Mode Exploit series. We've only done 5 episodes so far, but they're quite long videos, and it's following every single race that I've done in Sport Mode so far, and I've actually found that I enjoy it a lot. Now, if you ask me why do I enjoy it, and why don't I enjoy it as much in other games, I think I could give reasons why, and I'll probably get into that more in a second, but for now, the other game that I really enjoyed, genuinely loved in fact, the online racing aspect of, is totally different to GT Sport, and I don't even think it's a game that anyone would guess, based on the way I've talked about the game, based on the games that I've talked about loving in the past. It's not really a game that comes up all that often, but for me, funnily enough, it's the first Forza Horizon game. Because that game, somewhat ironically, really disappointed me when I first played it, because I played Forza 2, then 3, then 4, and then Horizon 1. And especially after Forza 4, which is such an expansive game, very much so like Gran Turismo 4 and 5 were, to then go into Horizon, Forza Horizon has by far the smallest career mode of any Forza game. I literally completed it in 2 days, and that really disappointed me because my experience up until that point had been pretty much purely playing career mode. And I don't mean I'd never done an online race, but as much as I didn't enjoy the online stuff anywhere near as much, because as I've said before on the channel, but for those who don't know, my most important things from any driving game for me to instantly love it are the amount of vehicles and the quality of the representation of those vehicles. So tuning, the graphics, the sounds, how the vehicles perform. So for instance, if the game is too arcade, like some trashy PS2 title with just a bunch of cars and, no thought to reality, well, even if it has cool cars, I probably won't enjoy it that much. But when a game strikes a balance between having the fun factor like Forza does with the realism of the graphics and the car selection and the tuning, that is when I tend to love a game. And that's why many of the older Gran Turismo titles are still my favourites, 2 and 4 in particular, because they offer just that. A ton of cars, a ton of tuning, and a massive career mode, especially in GT4 that keeps you going for such a long time with licenses, missions, racing, rally, tons of stuff, loads of individual manufacturer events, vehicles that you can't buy that you have to unlock. In many ways, of course, I've spoken before about the fact that I believe Gran Turismo 4 is the best overall Gran Turismo game we've ever had, certainly my favourite. And I think that if you remastered that game, it would do outstandingly well on, say, a PS4 or a PS5. So with all of that in mind, the reason I think why I enjoyed Horizon so much and why it really clued me into how much I could enjoy online racing was the quality of the online racing in that game was very much geared toward just being fun, not trying to necessarily be the best in the world. It was just, or maybe it was just me, I just happened to find a good group of people who were a lot of fun to race with, and we just had a great time. We had banter using, the headsets and talking and beatboxing and doing stupid impressions, racing up and down the highway and various other track layouts in the game, and it was just fun. It wasn't fun for the same reasons, though, as GT Sport, and that is an interesting thing for me, because that leads me to believe that for me personally, there are probably two things necessary for me to really love the online racing aspect of a racing game. One is shown by Horizon, and the other is shown by GT Sport. So on the one hand, the reason why I loved Horizon so much is because of what I just said. The banter, the fun, and just that quality group of people that you're racing with over and over again. Like a little posse, if you will, like your gang. On the other hand, you have none of that in GT Sport. It's not the banter side of things. There's no headset compatibility in general lobbies. You don't tend to race with the same people over and over again in sport mode unless you just happen to be in the same room. It's literally the total opposite. Instead of being unrealistic and purely based on fun, it's far more focused on having those regulations and penalties and all that kind of stuff. And yet I still enjoy that too. So how can that be? Well, I think the reason why is because the opposite to that reason that I love Horizon 4 is I love a game which, if it's going to do racing, I like it to have a very close but very definitive mix of that fun, but also take itself seriously. Now, that can be taken too far for me. When it's taken too far is stuff like Assetto Corsa or Project Cars. Not because the game is bad, there are tons of people who enjoy it, for instance, and, good on them for doing so, but when a game is so purely focused on just being as realistic as possible, and, completely focused in on using a wheel and pedals and all of that kind of stuff. Again, for those people who love it, that's great. But it immediately alienates everyone else who doesn't enjoy that. And there are certain people who love to say, oh, if you don't like using a wheel in games, you're obviously not a good driver in real life. Well, it just doesn't work like that. I do drive in real life. You guys saw my review of a £130,000 BMW, drove it just fine, and yet in a game I don't enjoy using a wheel at all. Because to me it's not realistic. Even in games that try to be, I've never enjoyed using a wheel, even GT Sport, that's why I don't. However, GT Sport, I think, strikes a very good balance, and this is something which, to some degree, Gran Turismo has always done a good job of, but of course, as the physics get more realistic, by definition, it becomes better, and that is, it is trying to be professional, it's trying to look like real life, to sound like real life, to have physics and, the tyre deformation and the suspension travel and all that kind of stuff, to make it authentic enough for people like the FIA to take it seriously, as they do, but at the same time it doesn't completely forget the fun factor. So you can still play and enjoy it on a controller. You can still drive with an automatic gearbox. You can still drive with your own tuning applied to the car. You can drive with really soft, bouncy suspension that goes all over the place, and you can still enjoy it. Now, of course, not all of that applies in sport mode. With balance of performance in particular, the tuning side is taken away. But I do love how it balances the professionalism with the fun. Now, as I said before, that is far from saying that I believe Gran Turismo Sport is a perfect game. Not even close. In fact, I have more qualms and negative points about GT Sport than pretty much any other Gran Turismo game in the whole series, and plenty of you guys know that. But I'm saying purely the online sport mode I found very fun, and I continue to. And of course another reason for that is probably because I haven't been doing it for as long, I haven't met as many bad drivers, etc. Although of course I have met some, and you'll see in the next installment of that sport mode series that I certainly had a much more challenging situation to go into because of certain changes in the race itself. Now, as far as why I enjoy those, I think I've touched on that enough. It's the fun factor combined with a game that takes itself just seriously enough, but not too seriously. Those two things in particular really lend themselves towards me enjoying it a lot. Now, as far as racing games in general, that is an interesting difference for me, and it might be different for you guys as well, because the reason why I enjoy those two games in terms of just the online aspect, is completely different to why I enjoy racing games in general. Because if you compare those two, neither of which are in my top 10 favourite racing games, incidentally, Gran Turismo Sport and Forza Horizon, neither of them are in my top 10. However, the reason why those that are in my top 10 are there, and that would include stuff like Gran Turismo 4, Gran Turismo 2, Forza 2, Forza 4, probably the first Test Drive Unlimited game, maybe Enthusia even, possibly. The reason why I love those so much, and even something like a Driver San Francisco would definitely be in there as well, the reason why I enjoy those is because when you completely take away the online aspect, which, to be honest, I don't miss that much, because if you have a good game, you don't need it. When you take that away, let's use Gran Turismo 4 as an example again, the reason why I love games like that is because of what I mentioned earlier. My number one important things in racing games have always been the cars that are in the game and what you can do with them. Just the sense of accomplishment when you buy a car dirt cheap from the used dealership, you tune it up in your own particular way, you take it up against cars which should beat you easily, and then you defeat them. And in the process you earn some cash, you complete the event, and maybe you unlock a car that you can't buy. Now that entire experience that I just described will probably initiate a certain feeling in those of us who have played older Gran Turismo games and older racing games in general. You'll probably have fond memories of what I just described. And unfortunately, those are feelings that a lot of younger players simply don't have. Because if you've grown up in a time when Gran Turismo Sport, for instance, was your first major experience at a racing game, then you just don't have that experience to draw from. It's a completely different kind of racing. And even if you grew up maybe just before GT Sport with Forza 6, or Forza 7, or Horizon 3, or Horizon 4, even then they're not the same. Games are so much about the online aspect these days that they really do sometimes sacrifice that offline career. Just look at the two that I mentioned. As much as I love the online racing in Horizon and GT Sport, look at what they both have in common. Pathetic career modes. GT Sport didn't even have one from day one. They had to add it later. And Horizon, as I said, could be completed in 2 days. So both of them are games which did not have the same attention put into career mode, which is yet another reason why they wouldn't be in my top 10. However, you compare that to those which are, like the Forza 4s and the Gran Turismo 4s, they're huge games. They're games with a ton of thought put into it back when career mode was actually something that mattered. And I miss that, to be honest. And it's not a case of looking to the past with a rose-tinted pair of goggles on. No, not at all. There's just a case of having something that's good quality and something which isn't. Something which gives you what you want from a game and something which doesn't. And for many of us, And not necessarily just older players either, because I'm not an old player. And even some younger players who have gone back to play those games, who have sent me messages, who have talked on the Discord server for the channel and various other things, have come back to me and said, you know what, I played those games and I see what you mean. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's such a different experience. No, you don't have the latest cars anymore, the graphics aren't as good, the physics aren't as realistic, but there's just something about that 2000s generation of games. Everything from the year 2000 with like Gran Turismo 3 up until, whatever, Forza 4, let's say. So between 2000 and 2010, pretty much. There's something about that time period where the games, the racing games in particular that came out therein, your Forzas, your Gran Turismos, your Enthusias, your Project Gothams, your Test Drive Unlimited, your Midnight Clubs, even your Need for Speeds, there was so much thought and effort and care put into those games, which, let's be honest, is simply not put in anymore. Now, you could argue, well, it's because games are harder to make now. The graphics require so much more, what would be the term? Implementing a car into the game basically is what I'm thinking of, but the amount of time it takes, for instance, to put a car into GT Sport, or how much more realistic the physics are, so it takes more processing power, all this kind of stuff, and it's all true. But at the same time, if all of those things were accomplished on an 8 megabyte memory card on a PlayStation 2, then don't tell me that a PS4 can't do better than what they're using it for. Because I'm sure that developers are doing their best. What I would argue is that their best is simply being directed in a less than stellar direction. And for sure, not everyone will agree with that. In fact, plenty of people would disagree. Of course, there are tons of people who love GT Sport. However, as I've said before, if I were to present the vast majority of GT Sport players with the following option, how do you think they would respond? If I said, okay, instead of GT Sport coming out in, December of 2017, I think it was, something like that. If instead of that, imagine that came out, and then a month later, or even at the same time, GT7 came out. A traditional Gran Turismo game with some element of online racing like GT6, but with the same kind of physics and the graphics, etc. of GT Sport. Maybe not with necessarily that many more cars, but more of a focus on the career mode and the offline aspect, and it didn't require being connected to the internet to save and stuff like that. How many people do you think would stick to GT Sport compared to that? Because there would be some, but I would argue, based on the track record of Gran Turismo, that there would be more people by this point that we are in now, almost 2 years on, there would be more people still playing that GT7 than playing GT Sport. And I could be wrong, but that's what I think. And the reason why I think that is not just based on my personal preference, it's based on a number of factors. It's based on the fact that people are getting disillusioned with the updates in GT Sport. You look at the comments, and it's gone from, back in the day, months and months ago, you would see people saying, oh, I want this car, I want that car. You still have some of those people, but if you look at the comments now, the tone has changed, and it has changed drastically. The comments used to be, oh, I don't like these cars, I want this car. I don't like that car, I want this car. I want this JDM Legend. I want that JDM Legend. I want this race car. That was all of the comments. If you look at the comments now, those comments have changed from that to, these updates are trash. Or, call me next month when there's an actual update worth looking at. That is a big shift. And although there were some people saying that before, there are far more saying it now. Now, that alone is not the only piece of evidence that I would argue leans toward a traditional Gran Turismo game. It's also stuff like the conversation, again, even on the Discord server. There are certain ones of you who a year ago would have argued against the points I'm making now, who now agree. You feel in the same position. You feel maybe Polyphony doesn't care as much about you as you thought they did. Maybe that they're not actually putting as much effort into this game anymore as you hoped they would be. Maybe they're doing exactly what I said Polyphony do, because they always do it, and that is focusing on the next project before they finish the current one. Which, I get that. I'm a creative person myself. I like writing books and creating videos and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, finish what you're doing now before you move on to the next thing. And Polyphony has always had that problem. I guarantee right now they're really wading into Gran Turismo 7's production, or whatever they're going to call the next game. We assume it's 7. But if that's at the detriment of what the people are playing now, then you're doing something wrong. That is simply the case. Because at the end of the day, I've mentioned this before and I'll say it again, Kaz and the team behind him have all the right in the world to produce whatever type of game they want. Of course, nobody's denying them that. However, that doesn't mean that we all have to support it. You can create whatever you want, but that doesn't mean I'm going to love it. On this channel, for instance, I could start producing videos in a similar way to what I mentioned last week. I could suddenly start saying, well, I'm only doing drift tunes. Well, it's still Gran Turismo, it's still tuning, and it's still for cars. But how many of you would still have the same interest? So it's not so much about what I can or can't have the right to do. That's irrelevant. It's just about what's a bad idea. It's as simple as that. If you have this built-in, loyal, and let's be honest, GT players are loyal to a fault. They are so loyal, such a huge group. They buy everything that Polyphony puts out, be it on the PSP, Taurus Trophy, whatever the case may be. Many of them have grown up with the franchise. Some of them have become real race drivers because of it, etc., etc. You take that, and then instead of focusing on that community, you start working on the next game, and you start neglecting the game that very community is currently playing. That's just a bad move. I don't care what the future goals are, that's just not a smart business move, and it's not loyal to the fans who are loyal to you. It's as simple as that. So, I'm not saying that they shouldn't work on the next thing. I'm saying that if you're going to do something, do it properly. Don't half do it after 6 months, and then move on to the next thing because you're bored, or because you want to accomplish something new, or for whatever other excuses or reasons. Do it well, do it properly. And don't forget that at the end of the day, if we, the fans, are not satisfied with what Gran Turismo or Polyphony is doing, they will fail. They can create whatever game they want. If nobody buys it, they're going to go down real fast. So they just are in this situation, and again, I don't want to fully get into this topic, but it still ties into what I was saying, because this is why my personal experience with why I do love racing games doesn't feel the same anymore. I don't love any modern racing game. The last game that I loved was Forza Horizon 3. And even that was, 2013 or something now? 2016 maybe? That's not that recent. That's years and years ago now, by gaming standards. I don't love GT Sport. I don't love the current Forzas. I have a lot of like for them, but I don't love them. And they certainly will never even worry the games that I mentioned before that I do love from the 2000s. And overall, I think that's it for my thoughts on this, because, again, I don't want to go too far into the Polyphony side of the discussion, even though I have touched on similar issues last week and this week, because that is going to be an entire episode in the future. But I think that those kind of tie in together. The reasons why I enjoy the online stuff in those games, the reasons why I don't enjoy the games themselves overall as much, the reasons why I think I do like racing games in general, it's more so about the cars for me. And again, just as a final point, and this is kind of tangentially connected, a lot of people ask me, do I watch F1? And they're always surprised when I say no. And the reason why I don't is because, and get ready for the hairs on your neck to stand up or whatever, I could not care less about the drivers. I never have, and I never will. The amount of drivers that I have respect and, whatever you want to label it for, can be pretty much counted on one hand. In fact, off the top of my head, I can only think of one, Stefan Beloff, and that was purely based on his lap time. I know nothing else about the guy apart from that he died. So I'm just not a driver's fan. I could not care less who is behind the steering wheel. F1 is all about who is behind the steering wheel, so I automatically have no interest in it. It's a soap opera with a steering wheel, as far as I'm concerned. I have only ever had interest in the car and in the team and in the event. The drivers and the behind-the-scenes drama interests me none. So that is probably also why a lot of these racing games just don't appeal to me in the same way. The whole Nations Cup thing with the top 1%ers and how great they are, and let us push them in your face constantly on the Gran Turismo channel, and aren't they so great? Sure they are. Who cares? I'm not here for those guys, I'm here for the cars. But at the end of the day, those are my thoughts. So of course, slap yours down below. Be sure to click the SoundCloud link and bookmark it or whatever for later on today if you do want to listen to the audio-only version. And this could potentially be an episode that goes back and forth in the comments, that's for sure. But slap your thoughts down below. Of course, if you watched the whole vid, thanks for that, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.